All right. Long time no see. I've had 4 days off. Today is actually it's day 28, but it's video 24. I missed 4 days due to being sick, and it's taken this long to get my my voice back, at least to the point where I think I can do a video. Hopefully, it's understandable. Hopefully I don't cough and hack through this completely. I'll be drinking a lot, which I'll probably have to edit out because you'll hear those huge gulps. But anyway, what I want to talk about today. So actually, let's bring up this card. I'll actually put these cards. I'll put these cards up here behind me somewhere because many of you have given good feedback and saying, you don't hold those cards up long enough, which makes sense. It does. But we've talked about discerning your purpose, and that was, I think, day 21 and 22. And I want to talk about discovering divine connections next. That's this guy right here. It'll probably be a couple days on discovering divine connections, because this is really kind of a prerequisite of the attitudes that we should have when we're focusing on discovering divine connections. And I want to start off actually before we get into anything. As you know, I've been pushing you to try out your own Zettelkasten, do your own Zettelkasten. So I want to encourage you, if you haven't already, pause this and start a source card. And if you're in a vehicle or whatever, and you're not going to be able to do that, or if you're not in front of your desk, but remember that you're trying to train your brain that I'm expecting something insightful here. That's what I want to find. So that being said, I can think of 2 prerequisites for discovering divine connections. The first one is humility. The second one is perseverance. Those are just 2. And I want to start off with James chapter 4, verse 6. It says that God is opposed to the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. If I think I already have all the answers, then I'm not going to be searching. I'm not going to be seeking. And I'm not going to be asking the right questions. And that leads us right into Matthew chapter 7, verses 7 and 8. And Jesus said, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened to you. And for everyone who asks receives, he who seeks finds, and him who knocks it will be opened. And I've heard preachers preach this many times, where they say those words that can actually be translated: keep asking, keep seeking, keep knocking. And so humility and persistence is key. But I want to talk a little bit about our brains, right? So I'm no expert in neuroscience by any means. In fact, I haven't been trained in it at all. I've just read books. So if you are an expert out there, and if I'm saying something that's totally wrong, let me know in the comments. Or if you think you have better understanding, let me know, because I would really like to make sure that I'm saying the right things and I know what I'm talking about at least a bit. Psalm 139, verse 14, it says, "And I will give thanks and praise to you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, and my soul knows it very well." We are fearfully and wonderfully made. This is my understanding. Our brains are better than any supercomputer out there. They run programs without being executed. They just automatically get executed from different responses. They are amazing. Now, they might not be able to compute all the... I'll tell you what. we're bringing in information from all of our senses constantly. They are doing so much computation and everything. It doesn't work quite like a computer does. So the analogy kind of breaks down, but our brains are powerful. And I'm actually gonna put this card up. I'll put it behind me somewhere where it makes sense when I do the edit. Our brains are predictive machines. And they're always trying to protect us. When I was a kid, we had a wood stove in our basement, and we heated our whole house with wood. As a young kid, my dad taught me how to put wood in the furnace overnight so that we could keep the house warm. And I'd get the poker and I'd, go in there and flatten out the coals. And then I'd go get, split wood, put it in there, stack it in there real nice, get it all nice and full, and then close everything down. And, so you don't have all your heat going right out the chimney. So it would circulate in the chamber and then eventually through the house with the blower. And when I first started doing this, one time I grabbed a piece of wood and I went to stick it in there, and to support myself, I reach up and, you can see what's coming. I reach up and, scolded my hand with, this is hot metal. I don't have any idea. We had a temperature gauge on there. I wish I would have looked, but my hand was hot. Welts popped up immediately. And my dad we had a back door where we threw the wood down, and he rushed me up outside, shoved my hand in the snow and to give me some kind of relief. But our brains, we have expectations based on experiences that we've had. Now, as a young kid, I'm sure I was told, that's hot, don't touch it. But it wasn't until I actually touched it that I got the message, right? My brain said, hey, that is hot. Don't ever do that again, And our brains are constantly doing this with all kinds of things. We perceive the world in based on our worldview. We do this thing called associative chaining. And it's pretty awesome how it works. Like I said, we get all this data coming in from our senses, and it gets organized. It's a pattern recognition system. So it recognizes these patterns and then sorts them down into where they fit, where our brain recognizes and then tries to make sense of all that data. Now, we do this not only with just raw data, but we do this with our reflections on the world. What do we observe about reality? What do we think about reality? And then ultimately, if some of these thoughts are strong enough or powerful enough, then we store some of this stuff as memory. Now, memory usually doesn't happen, right away, just as, if some data comes in. It usually has to be associated to some kind of an emotion or some kind of repetition. And that's when then those thoughts can be moved in and organized into our current worldview as it shuffles things around and moves things. This thing is most closely related to this idea. So, make room for it. At least that's how I understand it working. Now, context plays a huge part in this. When we're getting information, we might be in a place where we're interested in this subject over here. And then this piece of data comes in, or this piece of information comes in, and it's not really relevant to us. So, it just kind of slips through and doesn't get stored. But if I have something that I'm really interested in studying, and then all of a sudden I got this new piece of information and it interests me for whatever reason, my brain starts to say, hey, this is important, and starts to promote it in the hierarchy. And what's interesting is this is exactly how the Zettelkasten works. Making these associative chains of information. The feature of the Zettelkasten, one of the features, is just how we bring stuff into the Zettelkasten. We have our source. I talked about, will the real heretics please stand up? A new look at today's evangelical church in the light of early Christianity. Now, this is the third edition of this book, but this was the first edition of the book, and this isn't the first one that I had, because I think the first one kind of fell apart as I read it more and more. As we read our source, then we're going to end up, creating our source cards with all of our observation notes. I've got a bunch of them here that I'm working on. This is actually one on Jim Quick. He does quick learning, or he talks about memory a lot, and that's something that I'm super interested in right now. I've got all these notes, these observation notes that I've made from my source, and then now I want to go through these eventually, and I find something that stands out to me. I've already talked about this day 9, actually, so go back and watch that whole thing maybe. I go ahead and I promote one of these observation notes to a main note, and then I highlight the keywords and I put it in my index so I can store everything. But it's a physical kind of representation of what our brain, in a very limited way, of what our brain is doing constantly. And I think that's why it works so well. Sometimes, we've convinced ourselves that the world is one way, and we have expectations accordingly. But then all of a sudden our expectations, the outcome ends up being quite a bit different than our expectations. We have to potentially reevaluate. We have an opportunity to learn. Now, the thing about learning is that learning requires change, always. And change can be very uncomfortable. Like, take my diabetes, for example. When I was dealing with my diabetes, I was living one way, and I knew that I wasn't living healthy. But the stress of changing my life was higher than the stress of staying the same. And it wasn't until the stress of staying the same actually rised to a level above what the stress was for making a change that I decided I need to make a change. And that's the way with a lot of change, where we don't necessarily want to change. And so we put it off and we put it off until we absolutely have to. I don't know where this saying came from. I don't know if I came up with it or my wife came up with it or somebody else came up with it, but we do what we know and we know what we do. I've always done it this way. We've always done it this way. That holds people in bondage so much more than like physical things a lot of times, is just following the traditions that we've placed upon ourselves, because that's what we've always done. This quote is actually attributed to Albert Einstein, but nothing that I found actually has him writing this or anything else, but it says, the same level of thinking that created a problem isn't sufficient enough to solve that problem. And I think that's very key, very cool, because what got you into this is not necessarily going to get you out of this. And so what we have to do is we have to ask better questions. The road to truth is paved by asking the right questions, or asking enough questions, or asking enough of the right questions. In order to get out of the current problem, we're going to have to ask different questions, maybe bigger questions, but different questions. Our tribes play a huge part in this as well, right? And a lot of times we will offload, some of this need to change, or this need to to figure things out for ourselves. We'll offload that to maybe somebody in our tribe or a people group, or maybe it's an authority figure who we trust because their worldview kind of matches our worldview. So we kind of offload some of that decision making. That leads to groupthink, right? And kind of for us to surround ourselves and live in bubbles, right? Now, the social media algorithm is actually pretty amazing the way that it works. I know some of you had said, you're glad that the algorithm let you find this channel. I'm glad as well. And I think it's interesting because it bases all of that on what you've watched previously. And then somehow figures out that, hey, this thing might be of interest to you because you've watched this. And I think it's really neat. Now, there's this whole chicken and egg thing, right? With convergence. Did this happen because our interests matched, or did this happen because you've been being fed a certain style of information, and then your interest is growing based on being fed that information? And I think it might be a little bit of both. Christopher Hitchens, who I disagree with on a ton of stuff, but I really like this quote, and I've actually mentioned it before in other videos. He said, "Don't take refuge in the false security of consensus and the feeling that whatever you think, you're bound to be okay because you're safely in the moral majority." See, don't take refuge in the false security of consensus. Just because a majority of people believe something does not make it so. And in fact, I think a lot of times, if a majority of people believe something, there's probably more to the story. Because, we are emotional beings too. When we find something that, conflicts with the way we're living, let's take smoking, for instance. This is in my card that I have. We're pretty sure that smoking is bad for us. But if we continue to smoke, we're in this cognitive dissonance. We're living in this cognitive dissonance where we're doing things that are in conflict with one another, and it's causing the stress level to rise. So what we try to do then is to lessen the stress somehow. Either we stop smoking, or we say, oh, smoking's not really that bad for me. I know this lady who lived, 98 years old, and she smoked every day and day of her life. We can, which is another bias, by the way. There's all these biases that we have, and there's the affective heuristic where we make decisions based on emotions rather than objective evidence. We can look at someone's authority and start to hold the information that they put forth, higher than others. There's all kinds of biases and personalities and all kinds of things that can play on our emotions. The scripture says it's sharper than any two-edged sword, right? And it's piercing us. It's piercing our hearts. It's piercing us. We have that fight or flight reaction, potentially. Now, another reaction that we could have is submission, right? Can I be humble enough to take this in and really think, is this true? What should I do with this information? How should I react to this information? I admit in some ways that when in the past where I would not be interested at all to look at certain subjects because I disagreed with what I knew that the author was putting forth in that subject. I don't even have the time to bother with this, right? Or, I know the experts, and let the experts battle it out, and I watch debates, and, they'd bring up one good point, a good point here, and a good point there. and then, make determinations based on those debates and the rhetoric and everything. I really don't like debates. Don't like watching them anymore. I think it's all, not all, but I think many times it's about personalities and just, hey, I can throw this zinger out there and then I can gain some points. And I think it's less about really seeking the truth at times and more about personalities, more about winning the day. And I just don't appreciate it as much as I used to. Now, another thing is, before the Zettelkasten, is that I knew that if I'd read a book, I wouldn't necessarily remember it for very long. Now, if I kept going over it and over it, repetition again, if I kept going over it and over it, I might. But what I have found is that, again, I mentioned this before, the Zettelkasten, it is a tool for discovering, developing, and articulating our worldview on an ongoing basis. When I get a piece of information, when I come across something, I've already talked about this too, do I agree with this? Do I disagree with this? Now I don't have to have that fear anymore. I can say, well, no, I don't agree with this, but why don't I agree with it? And if I don't know the answer to that, I can still make a card for it with a question on it and store it for later. Or I can, if I do know the answer, I can write it down. I like this quote by Orson Scott Card. He's the one that wrote Ender's Game. He says, "We question all our beliefs except for the ones we really believe in. And those we never think to question." I like that quote a lot. What the Zettelkasten allows us to do is to allows us to have divergent thinking, free-flowing, non-linear discovery of ideas. We usually start with one thing, but it might take us in totally different directions and from our original thought. But then we have a way to capture these things. I used to use mind mapping a lot. I used to use a program called The Brain. I mentioned that too. And I like that, but there's a context to it. With the Zettelkasten, it is unlimited in what you can throw at it, what you can put in it. And I just make the suggestion that you only put stuff in there that really resonates with you. Kind of getting back to this idea of, the same level of thinking that created a problem isn't necessarily sufficient to solve that problem. There's another quote that a buddy sent to me, and I really liked this. He actually texted it to me. I don't know who. I never looked it up. I don't know who said this originally, but it says, "It's hard to hear God's voice when you've already decided what you want Him to say." I'll repeat that. It's hard to hear God's voice when you've already decided what you want Him to say. And, that kind of gets back to, this book, that, Will the Real Heretics Please Stand Up? And then, another book that I like quite a bit, and I was just talking to a buddy of mine who started reading it. Apart from I didn't suggest it to him or anything. He just started reading it. But he's been reading a book called Pagan Christianity by Frank Viola and George Barna. A lot of these books question the things that we do in modern day Christianity. And I think it's important. I think those are important questions to ask. Because, if we can get back to, God says, "I will build my church, my ecclesia, and the gates of hell will not stand against it." And we have a lot of tradition, right? Matthew 15, verses 8 and 9. And it says, "This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far away from me, teaching as doctrines the precepts of men." in we do what we know and we know what we do. Now we've had thousands, 2,000 years, I guess, of traditions built on traditions built on traditions. And, all the different denominations that we have in Christianity. And I want to get back. I want the truth. I want to seek the truth. I want to discover divine connections. I want to discover truth, divine truth. My Old Testament college professor, Reggie Webb, he's passed away now, but he said one time in class, I don't have the quote exactly, but he basically said, I want to be open-minded, but not so open-minded that my brain falls out. And he laughed and chuckled, and it was pretty funny. And Reggie is pretty cool. He's quadriplegic, and he always in his wheelchair, but he always had just the greatest attitude, at least publicly around us. And he had a hope within him that was just amazing. And I loved his attitude. I got a lot out of his material, a lot out of his teaching. And I remember the first thing he ever taught, first class, I didn't know the Bible very well at all when we went to Bible college. And the first thing he taught us was Joshua and the story, Joshua and then Judges. And it was a class that covered both of those Old Testament books. Joshua and Caleb, they went in with the other spies, went into this land flowing with milk and honey, and they found giants in the land. I mean, people, they felt like they were grasshoppers in their presence. And, they came back, all the other spies said, no way, we can't do this. And Joshua and Caleb said, hey, if God says we can do this, we can do this. And that was the first book that I ever studied. And it has stuck with me all these years. And I thank Reggie for that. It was a real message in victory, and overcoming. And, if God is for us, who can be against us, right? John Lennox, he talks about the promises of God. He's a mathematician. I believe he's also a philosopher, but I'm not 100% sure on what degrees he has. But he was saying in one of his videos that I was watching that he believes that we can use the scientific method to decide, is Christianity real? There's lots of caveats with this, right? But he says, if you you've got God's promise of transformation. Transformation is testable, right? His promises create expectations. And if those expectations, make it, then we see that the promise is potentially true. Now, the scientific method is a lot deeper than that, right? It's observation, questioning, research, hypothesis, experimentation, data collection, analysis, conclusion, replication, peer review and publication, theory development, and further research, right? I mean, it covers all kinds of things. But and when I say there's caveats to this, what I mean by that is that there are a lot of promises that get attributed to God that don't always come from God. That's important. There are a lot of people out there saying a lot of things about God that are not necessarily true, right? My suggestion is to always be very skeptical. Be very skeptical of what I say. Be very skeptical about what other people say. Be like the noble-minded Bereans in Acts. Is that 17? I don't think it is. 9? I don't remember. Be like the noble-minded Bereans. When Paul came and preached to them, it says that they went home and they searched the scriptures daily to find out if what Paul was saying was true. That's what we need to be doing. We need to be searching for the truth and seeing where it leads us in humility and being persistent, asking, seeking, and knocking. But I want to give an example. I was watching this video on deconstructing, right, Christianity. And it was one of these guys, and he was explaining why he's no longer a Christian. He was explaining why he no longer believed that the Bible was the Word of God. He was explaining why he no longer believed that Jesus was really a man that came and died and was raised from the dead. And he said something along these lines. He said, when I was a Christian, when I believed, I was all in. I had so much faith. I believed all the promises of God. I believed God would heal, God would take care of us, God would protect us, and that if he believed enough, God would manifest his will. Now, there's a teaching out there, and it's called the Word of Faith movement. And it's teachers like Kenneth Hagin, E.W. Kenyon, and others. This idea that we need to manifest God's promises by confessing these things over our lives. Now, what does that do? It turns God into a vending machine of sorts, or maybe like a spiritual Santa Claus, right? The scripture says we will suffer. Those who desire to live godly will suffer. It's not about health, wealth, and happiness. It's not about those things. How many things have we accepted because somebody in authority has said that it's true, or somebody has, thrown out some big emotional message that our itching ears want to hear, and we buy it, or it makes us feel good, or whatever it is. How many of these things have we accepted as true that may not necessarily be true? We need to be careful. I want to read a scripture here. This is Galatians 5:16 and 17. So I gave you an example of a promise that man made, that this guy, he's following what man says to do, and he's not getting the expectations, so he throws his faith and everything right out the window. He was just never taught real Christianity from the scriptures. Now, I want to give you a real Christianity from the scriptures. This is Galatians 5:16 and 17. Walk by the Spirit, and you will not carry out the desire of the flesh. For the flesh sets its desire against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh, and these are in opposition to one another, so that you may not do the things that you please. That's just one verse I grabbed. Walk by the Spirit, and you'll not carry out the desire of the flesh. So if I ask the question and I say, okay, am I carrying out the desire of my flesh? Now, if I am, then what must be the correlation? Well, I must not be walking by the Spirit, or I don't understand walking by the Spirit. Something's not connecting there. Then I got to start asking more questions, deeper questions. What does it mean? What does walking by the Spirit mean? Who is the Spirit? What is the Spirit? And then, I can start asking questions, not only in the Bible, but I can start asking, those first century questions. What did the early church believe, walking by the Spirit meant? The road to truth is paved by asking enough of the right questions. In summary, our brains are amazing. Our worldviews can be stubborn, sometimes look to our tribe, maybe too much, look to the authority figures, maybe too much. The Zettelkasten allows us to not fear these things when they're presented to us, but actually take them and kind of set off on an adventure in a way where, yeah, I'm expecting to find the answers eventually, right? Being persistent, being humble. I want to end with a quote from Mark Twain. It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. Keep seeking the Lord's face. God bless.